Hi everyone, I'm John Arnold. I want to welcome you back to another Practical Disciple video. If you were here for the last video I did, we took some time and we looked at the opportunity that's available to us to really enrich our lives if we'll just simply take and invest regularly a little bit of time in prayer. It doesn't have to be a mountain of it, but it has to be consistent. We have to take some time out and on a daily basis put some really concentrated time into prayer. And I shared the example of a woman in the life of our congregation named Miss Lena, who died not too long ago. And she had this incredibly rich life, rich in family and friends and wisdom and peace. You need to watch that video to see. I think it's a snapshot of what's the possibility if we take time in regular prayer. And one of the things that Miss Lena did was every day she sat down at her kitchen table in the morning and she spent time in the Word and she prayed. And I would encourage you to go back and watch that video if you didn't, because what I also did in that was not just talk about the opportunity, but I kind of handed you something to help equip you to step into being more consistent in prayer. And I talked about the value of having prayer spaces in our life, which is kind of an overlooked strategy. I don't know that I've had anybody ever tell me I needed to do that. And I share with you my 3 most common prayer spaces. So, thank you if you saw that video. I really appreciate the comments that people sent. Some people sent me direct messages, and it was great to see that become a bit of a conversation. And it's not too late to get in on that conversation. There's a comment section below the video. I would really love for people to go in there and I want to hear about your prayer spaces. So that's where we've been. Now today, I want to tackle what is one of the absolute biggest problems that people report to me when it comes to prayer. And I'm going to back up a little bit to do time hop here. About 20 to 25 years ago, one of the very first times that I led a workshop on prayer, I sat people down, I broke them up into small groups, and I said, okay, I want you in a few minutes to brainstorm like a top 10 list, kind of David Letterman style, of what are the top 10 problems you struggle with, what's your top 10 struggles with prayer. And at that time, as I repeated that workshop with different groups of people, there was a pretty good consensus, let's just call it that, a pretty good consensus that the number one problem was finding time with prayer. It's like everybody seemed to have a little bit of sense of, I really feel like I should be spending more time in prayer. And that bothered them, that disturbed them. That was the number one concern. In the last 5 to 10 years, I've seen a distinct shift where that's still a concern for people, but the number one reported problem, what do you think it is? Pause, think about what your biggest struggles are, and I'm just curious if it's going to connect with you. I sent out a survey to folks, and those of you on that survey, if what you said was focus, then you were right. The number one thing that I hear people now saying is, I have the hardest time when I sit down in focusing on God. Like I sit down to pray, and it's like I enter into a wrestling match with 100 other ideas in my head. I have all the best intentions in the world, but within a few minutes, I'm thinking about my grocery list. I'm thinking about a conversation I had with someone at work. I'm thinking about a phone call I need to make. My mind just is wandering all over the place. I get lost in a problem that's bothering me. Or another one, and I'm going to kind of address this or say a little bit more about, I fall asleep. I cannot pay attention during prayer. My mind either wanders or I just resonate for anybody. Okay, if that's ever your problem, here's the good news. That's the bad news. It's part of the bad news. The good news is, of all the problems out there that you could have with prayer, focus is actually one of the easiest to address. And I'm going to explain to you kind of what you need to do, and I'm going to give you at least a little bit of how. I mean, I did a whole webinar on this once, and I've done a whole weekend workshop before on it. So there's a lot of ground here, but I at least want to give you 1 or 2 concrete things you can sink your teeth into if you're struggling with prayer, and hopefully get you to a place where you can hyper-focus and be present to God. Now, before we do that, I want to explain to you why this should concern you. Why should you be concerned about focus? Well, here's the deal. Imagine that, like, we're good friends and you're struggling with something. You call me up one day and you're like, man, John, do you have any time? I really need to talk to you because I don't know what to do about this problem. I'm like, yeah, that's cool. Let's go to lunch. So we meet somewhere for lunch and we're sitting there and you're like, I've got this problem. And you start laying out your problem to me, and I just want to know what you think I should do about it. And I listen to you really closely and I'm soaking it in. There's ideas coming to me. And then you get done. I'm like, well, okay, yeah, here's some things you could do. I really think it would be great if, and I start explaining to you just what you need. And I look up, though, and suddenly I realize you're not listening. You're on your phone. You're texting somebody. I don't know, playing Candy Crush. I don't know what you're doing, but you're on your phone. And I'm like, hey, excuse me? Didn't you want to talk about? Oh, yeah, sorry about that. Like, put it away. And then I start talking to you again. And then all of a sudden, somebody goes walking by behind me and you go, oh, hey, Bill, how you doing? And I'm like in the middle of trying to share with you something that's going to help you out. And suddenly you're like, oh, hey, Bill, listen. Oh, I want you to meet, oh, hi, this is so-and-so, da-da-da. And like, you're a million miles away. And then you sit back down. And then it's another thing and another thing and another thing. And we get nowhere through the whole lunch. And before you know it, the time's gone. And you're wandering off to the next thing. Now, that's what we do a lot of times in prayer. We're entering it. We come to God and we're like, God, I really need to talk to you about this. And I need help. I need discernment. And we lay our problem out there, and then we take no time to sit back and listen and absorb, or we're just have a very narrowly defined conversation with God because there's no depth to it because we can't focus long enough to have any depth to that relationship. It's always on the surface because we're always getting distracted and drugged and pulled somewhere else. That's what's happening in our relationship with God. And the result is not having a life like I described a moment ago of being like rich in wisdom, rich in family and friends because you have a servant's heart, rich in peace because you're grounded in God and you have this wonderful connection with God. I want to share something with you real quickly. I had to write it down. I couldn't remember this whole quote. But I think this is where a lot of people end up, or they're living right now. And I lived in this space a long time and I fall into it sometimes. There's a man named Jonathan Aiken. If you never heard his name, Jonathan Aiken was in British Parliament and he perjured himself. He wrote a book called Pride and Perjury, I think is the name of the book. I'll have to look that up. But anyways, in his book, he's talking about the transformation that went on in his faith when he kind of lost everything, when he perjured himself and he went to prison, and his faith took on a whole new meaning as things were stripped away and he turned to God during that time. And he said, I used to treat God as if he was my bank manager. And this is how he described it. He said, I spoke to him politely, visited his premises intermittently, occasionally asked him for a small favor or overdraft to get myself out of difficulty, thanked him condescendingly for his assistance, kept up the appearance of being one of his reasonably reliable customers, and maintained superficial contact with him on the grounds that one of these days he might come in useful. And you know what? I think it's all too common that that's where people are, or that's where we find ourselves living. And a lot of that is honestly due to a lack of really in-depth time with God. That we're only interacting with God superficially, and focus is one of the big problems with that. You don't create deep intimacy with God if you can't create deep conversation with God. I think it's almost virtually impossible. And I have found that the quality of my life in many ways is directly proportional to the quality of my prayer life and the quality of my connection with God, how deep it is. So, what do we do about that? I mean, how do we cut through the noise in our head long enough to be fully present to God and get grounded in God so we can know that peace that surpasses all understanding? Here's what it boils down to. Grab a marker. Focus, by and large, it's a matter of managing two things. Being able to focus involves managing the engagement of our mind and the engagement of our body actively. Let me repeat that. Being able to focus in prayer is almost entirely a matter of engaging consciously our mind and body. Engaging consciously our mind and body. What do I mean by that? I'll give you a quick example. I was driving home. I had driven to St. Louis and back. Drove up one day, drove back. I'm 9 hours from St. Louis. I'm on the back end of that. So I've had 18 hours of drive time in the last, little over 24. And I'm tired, and I'm like, you know what, though? This is a perfect opportunity for me to, just chat with God, because I'm going down the highway. I'm a captive audience. It's me, God, and highway. So great time to pray. And I go to start praying, and my mind just starts wandering off. It's flittering all over the place. And I find I can't last over a couple mile markers, and I'm off and gone somewhere. So here's what I did. I started to pull out of my tool bag of conscious engagement of mind and body. I pulled out of that tool bag. I thought, you know what? I'm going to pray out loud. That's praying out loud is one simple way to engage the body, all right? Because I'm now physically praying, if you will. So let's put that down here as an example. I start praying out loud. And I'm still having trouble focus. So I decide I'm going to up it a notch. And now I start singing. I'm like, I'll sing praises to God, Surely I can stay focused if I'm singing. I was still, believe it or not, and you're starting to engage more of your mind when I started singing, because I'm trying to recall lyrics, and I'm trying to recall, and I'm no good at that. My family will tell you, I'm always singing songs, and I think I'm singing them right, and I'm making up words. Well, I start falling into that where I'm struggling. I'm like, oh, I remember that first verse, and I don't remember the second one. So I'm not really in a prayerful. So then I decide, you know what? I'm going to make a song right now. I'm gonna start pouring out my own heartfelt praise song, and I chose to do that I was singing. But what I started doing was I started using what I call the formula of praise. And this is something I recognized out of Psalm 118. I've got some stuff on my prayer site. I think it's also in my book as well. Quick Start Guide to Tips on Prayer, Quick Start Guide to Better Prayer Life. But basically what that little formula boils down to is I start out with I love you, God. And then I had under I love you, God, then I'm extolling God for who God is, and then I'm extolling God for what God does. And I'm just free form singing this stuff in the car. But I'm engaging my mind now because I'm trying to creatively come up with something to be able to do that. And it took a little while, but by golly, bam, that stuff, when I started stacking those tools out of my toolbox, before you know it, I'm really focused. I'm really feeling in the presence of God. My heart and my mind have shifted full on into praise. I'm having this great experience of God going down the highway. But the reason I was able to do that was I had a tool bag of engagement strategies for my mind and my body. And there's lots of these. I'll just to give you a taste of a few things that you can use. One way to engage your mind, I've already told you one way, and that is to use prayer methods. Hope hope you all can read this all right. But, you got me talking over it too, so hopefully that'll help. Prayer methods, that's what this is. There's a lot of them out there. The ACTS prayer is one of my favorite, and I have seen people use ACTS, which is ACTS, adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication. I've seen people use that prayer, and it's opened the door up for them a whole new level on having a prayer life that is broader, richer, deeper. Just a couple example of methods out there. There's one called the Examen from the Catholic tradition. There's one that's great with little kids called Five-Finger Prayer, where each finger kind of mnemonically helps you think of a different thing to pray for. So there's lots of prayer methods or formulas out there. Those actively engage the mind. It's almost like, I bet a lot of you have gone into meetings and nobody had an agenda for the meeting. And what happens? It kind of meanders all over the place and you may or may not get something done productively. But if you come in and you have a heartfelt intention, an agenda for how you're going to spend your time, then some really cool, rich things can happen. That's kind of what a prayer formula does. And at first, I will say it can feel artificial and kind of clunky because you're like trying to think through, am I doing it right? Well, what was the next piece? That's just learning curve stuff. Once you get over that, then you can kind of fall into a rhythm and it can very, very quickly help you focus your mind. Okay? So does that make sense? I hope it does. Doesn't? Please put a question in the comments below. I mentioned singing. Singing engages both mind and body. This actually engages both sides of both hemispheres of your brain. You're praying with more of your brain when you're singing than when you pray once. Can't think of who it was, and I know who I need to ask. Sue Ellen, I'm going to be asking you this. If you see this, someone once said, when we sing, we pray twice. And I think there's a literal truth to that because we're using twice as much of our brain, kind of. We can also do things like bodily. Sometimes I will go for a walking prayer, and walking can be a catalyst, a trigger for me staying in prayer. Posture, the posture we choose can help us focus. I don't pray from my knees a whole lot, but whenever I'm on my knees and praying, my mind does not wander. It's such an intentional process, a posture, that it becomes a catalyst for staying mentally focused as well. So there's lots of different ways we can engage the body. The mind, I mentioned prayer methods. I'll mention one more and then I want to wrap this up because honestly I could probably fill this whiteboard, but this gives you at least a place to start. Conscious ways to engage mind and body. Devotional guides. Books, devotional guides can engage your mind because what they do is they expose you to new material that you're having to think about and process. And there's devotional guides on everything, and you can find some devotional guides that are actually kind of, to me, hyper-loaded to keep us engaged because they maybe hit on an active interest. Like, for instance, we found a devotional guide that we got for our son, and it's Reflections from a Deer Stand. It's like prayerful meditations and reflections that are rooted around like being out in nature. And our son's hunter, loves the woods and that kind of thing. I was like, man, that is going to engage his mind. He opens up that devotional guide and he's going to be on it, So some examples. One last one on the body. I did this one time. I was away. I had driven up to St. Louis because my brother was having surgery and I needed to have my prayer time. I hadn't had it. It was the middle of the day. We're waiting surgery. So I went and found the chapel. But I was so dead dog tired from driving up and getting very little sleep. It's like, man, I can't pay attention. Here's what I did. Very simple. I wrote out my prayer. Handwriting. Get a prayer journal. Physically writing out your prayers. Kind of hard for your mind to wander. If your pen stops, pencil stops, you know you're not praying anymore. That's body engagement in prayer. Hope that totally makes sense. So focus, again, is completely, almost entirely about managing consciously mind and body engagement with prayer. Okay? Got questions? Put them in the comments below. There's one last piece I want to put out there about this. There is something that can trump all of this and override it, and I've already kind of hinted, though these things can help you cut through it, and that is, I'm going to put this in a big red marker over everything, and it may kind of blur out here, but fatigue can mess all of this up. A lot of people are struggling with prayer simply because they're not observing any of the God-given natural rhythms that we have, and we're out of balance, and you're out of whack, and you're fatigued, and you cannot have a meaningful relationship with God in prayer if you can't stay awake, you can't focus, you can't talk. You know, if you're just walking around in a state of fatigue and tiredness, you're going to get stuck in a zone where your relationship with God's going to be superficial because you could just give so little energy to it. And this is a huge problem because we've completely lost a sense of Sabbath, and we also have pretty much, many folks are out of sync with even any kind of daily rhythm of getting good rest. I was mentoring, I'm going to interject one little last story here. I was mentoring 3 college students who, these were pretty, I handpicked them. I like cherry-picked these 3 college students because I knew they had the potential to all maybe wind up in ministry because they had such strong, vibrant, intentional faiths they invested themselves in. And for a mentoring thing I was going to do for Lent a few years ago, all 3 of them were struggling with just getting through daily Bible reading. And eventually I realized what it was. All 3 of them were overextended and struggling with fatigue. So, you know what? These will help you. Like when I picked up a pencil and I started writing my prayers, even though I was exhausted, it helped me stay focused. My mind didn't wander. But I don't know how rich of a conversation that really was because my mind was just so weary. I don't know what I could really, offer to God. Better to go to God tired and fall asleep, than not. Somebody once told me when you fall asleep in prayer, it's almost like a kid falling asleep in the lap of their father. And I'm like, that's cool and sweet, and that is good, and that's right. But, there comes a point, too, where we want to really actively engage with that Heavenly Father so we can develop a mature relationship, and we can grow and have all the riches of the fruits of the Spirit that are available to us because we're just so actively engaged with God. I hope this really helps you with focus. Again, if you have questions about this, please fire them down in the comments. Like I said, I'd love for this to be a conversation rather than a presentation. Coming up, next video, I'm going to lay out for you kind of the overall system. I want to give you a bird's eye view of the system that I use that can really transform your prayer life. It can help you move from being in that place of Jonathan Aiken of superficial contact with God to a place of being kind of where Miss Lena was, of a mature relationship with God that's grounded and knows God's peace and is able to deal with the strife and struggle of life from that grounded godliness. I have a system I call the 5 Pillars of Life-Changing Prayer. I'm going to give you a little bit of overview of that in my next video. So I hope you'll be back for that. And please, like this, share it with a friend, wherever you saw it, make a comment below. And I will look forward to seeing you in another video soon. Bye now.